Just over a year ago, Teagasc, in collaboration with a very broad range of partners in the agri-food industry, launched the Signpost Programme. We now have 120 farms in the programme involved in demonstration and research. A key part of the programme is to record on-farm technical and financial data to benchmark and track progress towards achieving our greenhouse gas emissions and environmental targets. This morning I will be joined by Professor Frank O'Mara, Director of Teagasc, Dr. Cathal Buckley of the National Farm Survey and Dr. Tom O'Dwyer, Head of the Signpost Programme, to discuss the findings of data collection. Also joining us will be Dr. Cara Augustenberg of UCD to give her reaction to the first year of the programme. Good morning and welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar, which is brought to you in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland SkillNet and the National Rural Network. Before we get into looking at the gathering and processing of the first year's data, we will have a look at a short video on why farmers are engaged in climate action.
Climate change is probably the greatest challenge facing the world right now. We all have a role to play in reducing its impact through the choices that we make. The Signpost Programme is supporting and enabling farmers to make the right choices.
We want to leave this farm in a better condition than we got it in. We are fortunate to live in a beautiful part of this world.
Our children and all future generations of our family, the local community and wider society deserve the same opportunity to enjoy this beautiful country.
Well, look, it's inevitable that we're going to be introducing regulations to help us farm in a more sustainable way, which I fully agree with. And I'd rather make those changes now to suit my farming system as opposed to those regulations being imposed on me in the future.
I want to be sure that the customer wants to buy the product that I produce. The customer is getting more and more aware of the environment and how food is produced on farm.
I want to do my share to reduce emissions, which will hopefully help reduce the risk of severe weather events happening, like the ones we had in 2018. We all have a role to play, no matter how small.
Implementing the technologies to reduce emissions is a win-win for my farm. Many of the changes that I'm making are also helping to reduce my farm costs.
solution to climate change. Carbon farming, forestry, energy generation and diversification will all offer opportunities to me and others.
I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Professor Frank O'Mara, Director of Teagasc, to outline the work that is being done on measuring sustainability on the Signpost farms and in the National Farm Survey, and to outline the progress towards developing a digital sustainable framework for the use with all farmers. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Pat, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this morning at this webinar to mark the provision of sustainability reports to the farmers in the Signpost Programme. This was always seen as a key element of the Signpost Programme. The basic premise of any demonstration farm programme is that you use exemplar farmers to demonstrate best practice to other farmers. But to do this, you must have information on those farms, their performance and their progress. So for the Signpost Programme, we were really lucky that we had a ready-made system for measuring sustainability performance on farms that we had been using in the National Farm Survey for many years. And we decided to use this methodology with the farmers in the Signpost Programme. And with funding from our partners, we were able to hire additional recorders for the National Farm Survey to make this possible. The key development here is that now we have individual farmer sustainability reports for the Signpost farms. While we had those type of reports and information on the farms in the National Farm Survey for many years, we weren't able to talk about those individual farms to other farmers because they're all anonymised. So now we have that for the Signpost farmers, and that's a very powerful knowledge transfer tool that we can use as part of the programme from here on. This is a major advance. I think it's very important that farmers know where they stand, and so that's where we're at now with the sustainability reports. The farmers in the Signpost Programme, they know what their current emissions are, what their baseline are, and they can track their progress over time in relation to that. And we think it's very important that all farmers that want it are actually in a position to do the same thing. So we are building a digital tool with ICBF and Board BIA that will allow any farmer who wishes to see what their own sustainability performance is. So for instance, what are their emissions of greenhouse gases, and also how much carbon are they sequestering on their farm. And we think that's going to be a major advance in terms of working with farmers and allowing us then, with our advisory service, to develop plans with those farmers to reduce those emissions or enhance that sequestration. Back to this morning's reports and what we're presenting here. It is important to realise that the first sustainability reports that farmers are getting are just a baseline. And what will be really important is how those metrics in the sustainability reports evolve over time and hopefully improve over time. That's the journey that we're on with the farmers in the Signpost Programme. I think what is very heartening though is when we look at the metrics in the sustainability reports and compare them with the National Farm Survey Sustainability Report, which we launched just last Monday. And that report gives us a national picture, and it does show that there's a very encouraging trend for the adoption of key technologies across all the farms in Ireland. So things like protected urea, low emission slurry spreading, the use of lime. But what's even more heartening is to see that our Signpost farmers as a group, they're well ahead of the average farmer in the National Farm Survey. So obviously we're working with a group of very forward-thinking farmers in the Signpost Programme who want to take action on their farms to address climate change. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the rest of the reports throughout the webinar, and I'll hand you back now to Pat.
Cathal Buckley coming to us from Galway to give us some background into the Teagasc National Farm Survey Sustainability Report and how the team are leveraging that system to provide information on the Signpost farms on an individual and a group basis. Cathal.
Outline how we've been tracking sustainability through the Teagasc National Farm Survey basically for the last decade. So I'd like to acknowledge colleagues Trevor Donlan and Brian Moran who are heavily involved in this work also. By way of an overview, I'm going to go through how conceptually we think about sustainability, the data we collect in the National Farm Survey, the indicators, how we develop the indicators, and then how we link in with the Signpost Programme. Okay, so conceptually, it's well established that sustainability has three main dimensions: an economic dimension, an environmental dimension, and a social dimension, much like a three-legged stool. We also include an innovation dimension. So, the innovation helps to buttress the other three legs of the stool to make it a strong and stable system. If there's failure of one leg of one dimension or one leg of the stool, essentially you have a risk of unsustainable farm system. So conceptually, we think of sustainable agriculture as nested between those four dimensions. In terms of the data we collect through the National Farm Survey, well, it is a long history going back to 1972 when we started to join the then EEC. We were required to report on farm incomes by law under our accession treaty. And since then, we've been part of what's called the EU Farm Accountancy Data Network. So Teagasc National Farm Survey fulfills this requirement to provide these economic data to the European Commission year on year. So it started out as an economic survey we were obliged to conduct. Teagasc, we're lucky that Teagasc was a collection agency because we go well beyond what's required by the Commission in the FADN network, and we collect a range of other data that's useful to answer a number of range of policy questions. And through this framework, we started to develop our environmental metrics in recent times. As the director has said, the data is collected by a very professional team of dedicated farm recorders. They visit the farm visit each farm 2 to 3 times per year. Everything is cross-validated and verified. Now, there is a proposal under the EU Farm to Fork strategy to transition from the EU FADN, Farm Accountancy Data Network, to a farm sustainability network to look at wider issues than economics. So we're ahead of the game here in terms of we've gone this direction before this proposal was ever mooted. In terms of the sample size, we generate the NFS reports. It collects data on generally between 850 and 900 farms. And the regular report splits into 6 systems: specialist dairying, cattle rearing, which is tillage, sucker-based cattle udder, specialist sheep, specialist tillage, and mixed livestock. We amalgamate those into 4 for our reporting purposes. As the director has said, we launched the most recent report last Monday. We kind of published a comprehensive range of results. We started a journey in 2013. Last Monday was the 7th iteration of the report. We report by main farm system, land-based farm system, dairy, cattle, sheep, and tillage. We report across the 4 sustainability dimensions: economic, environmental, social, and innovation. And the most recent year, we published in the order of 129 indicators for 2021. We also go back in time in terms of, we go back 6 years in the report and we do rolling 3-year averages in case that, there's a positive or negative price shock in any given year, so we can see a long-term trend. So it's really the temporal trends where you see the interesting developments. And the web link there at the bottom right of the page is where the 7 reports can be found. The most recent reports up there now, including the webinar, if anyone who wants to look at it and missed it last Monday. Okay, so starting with the economic leg of the stool, we report on 6 indicators. So, economic returns to land in terms of gross output, gross margin, family farm income per hectare and per unpaid labour unit, and market orientation in terms of percentage of the revenue derived from the market versus subsidies, and economic viability in terms of, can the farm return the minimum wage plus a 5% return on non-land-based assets. So they're the 6 we report through time. Look, we slice and dice the data in a range of different ways. So we report by farm system, within farm system. So the average can hide a lot. So that second graphic there is kind of a distribution of dairy farm incomes per family income per hectare. So you can see, there's a huge distribution in terms of results. We also, as I say, publish by 3-year rolling averages. So, if there's a negative or positive price or weather shock, this is kind of smoothed out so you're trying to isolate long-term trends in the data. Moving on to the social leg of the stool, we've 3 indicators in household structures in terms of household vulnerability, where the farmer has a risk of isolation and it's a high age profile of a farm, whether the farmer has agricultural education, and then hours worked on farm and total hours worked on and off farm in terms of, it's an indicator of work-life balance. So again, we report across systems and in terms of time trends. So you can see there on the right-hand side, for example, we see that dairy farmers, the amount of time they're spending on and off farm is increasing through time. So then finally moving on to the environmental leg of the stool, we have two broad indicators under gaseous emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. First, we use IPCC methodology across all farms, and we use LCA for dairy across both ag and energy sectors or categories. For ammonia, we use the national inventory accounting approach replicated by the EPA, so we apply the national method at a farm scale. In terms of risk to water quality, we use a farm input-output approach where we're tracking inputs versus outputs, and then we generate balances and use efficiencies. And for biodiversity, we have a framework in development, and we're kind of waiting for the publication of the national habitats map to take that work forward. So hopefully in years to come, we will add a biodiversity indicator to our set of suite of measures. In terms of the environmental indicators, we publish 16 in the most recent iteration. So it's agricultural and energy-based GHG emissions for farm, per hectare, per kilogram of main product, milk, meat, milk, beef, sheep, and so on, and per euro of output. For ammonia, again, per farm, per hectare, and per kg of output. And for nitrogen and for the water quality metrics, imbalances and use efficiencies, NMP balances and use efficiencies. So again, look at this is just a range of data we publish. This is we slice and dice the data in different ways in terms of this is per farm level emission, this is per hectare level emissions, ag-based emissions. This is the emissions intensity footprint of milk production, and this is emissions per kg or per euro of output generated. So as I say, we would publish across a range, absolute emissions, emissions intensity, and emissions related to revenue. We also, as the director said, we're trying to track change in farm practice, which is desirable. So, for example, we've started to look at things like low emission slurry spreading and protected urea. So, at both a farm and an aggregate level, we're seeing massive transition towards low emission slurry spreading at farm and aggregate scale. And these numbers actually will feed into the national inventories and help to reduce our ammonia emissions in the long run. So, in conclusion, we started around 2008 to look at the increasing capacity through the National Farm Survey to develop these sustainability indicators. The data is collected by a team of very professional farm recorders, and it's validated by the admin team in the National Farm Survey. The economic metrics, we follow the EU FADN conventions in the metrics we report. For the social metrics, we're guided by the literature, and these are subject to ongoing developments. And a colleague, Dr. Emma Dillon, presented some updates on this side last Monday also. In the environmental metrics, we follow national or international conventions. So, for example, we use the IPCC guidelines for GHG. We use the national inventory counting processes for ammonia and so on. We started the journey in 2013, and last Monday was the 7th iteration of the report. As I say, we went from every second year to every year. So we've a definitive time series now. And we didn't start with 129 indicators. We've been adding these along the way, and we'll continue to add these indicators as the data and the science allows us to. And it's the results, the time series results, that are really the most interesting, as the director has said. Can we track progress through time? So this infrastructure then has been brought to bear on the Signpost farms. So the same procedures and protocols we collected on general NFS farms, we collect on Signpost farms. And they're benefited from our knowledge and mistakes and learnings since we developed it in 2013. So in years to come, when multiple years of data becomes available in Signpost farms, that's when the progress will be judged. And 2021 is really the base year, the starting point. And it's the Signpost farms are started the journey much like we were back in 2013. So thank you. Thanks for listening. That's my email address if anyone has follow-up questions, and that link there is where all the previous 7 reports can be downloaded and looked at. So I'll hand back to you, Pat, in the studio.
Okay, thank you, Cathal. Could I just remind you to submit your questions using the Q&A facility? Cathal, we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I suppose the first question that we have in it just asks about the comparison between the results on the Signpost farms and on the National Farm Survey, a more representative sample.
Sure, Pat. I suppose like the farms in the National Farm Survey were given to us by the Central Statistics Office to be representative of farms nationally based on size and system. The Signpost farms, were self-selected into the programme. So they're not selected to be representative of the national population. If I was to put them in terms of comparability, okay, there are some farms, dairy farms and beef and sheep farms that are similar to the average farm. But if you take them as a whole, they're probably at the upper end of the distribution in terms of intensity. So they're probably they're more intensive than the average farm in general.
Okay, thank you for that, Cathal. Tom O'Dwyer will now present the initial findings of the first year's data from the Signpost farms. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning. The Signpost Programme is a new initiative launched by Teagasc in 2021, and the purpose of the Signpost Programme is to lead and support the transition of Irish farming towards more sustainable farming systems. It's a whole of industry approach, and we have 62 partners who are part of the Signpost Programme, working together with Teagasc to help farmers as we move to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from Irish agriculture. There are 3 parts to the Signpost Programme. Firstly, a network of demonstration farms, which we call the Signpost Farms. Secondly, a more broad-based signpost advisory campaign to work with and engage all farmers across the country. And thirdly, the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, which is a research experiment started in 2020 and of which the Signpost Farmers are all a part. So they're the 3 elements of this overall Signpost Programme. What I'm going to present today largely are the results recorded from the Signpost farms in 2021, and just towards the end of my presentation then I will have 2 slides with some results that are coming through from NASCO. This chart just shows the Signpost farms. We have 119 Signpost farms spread right across the country, covering the various different enterprises including dairy, suckler beef, dairy calf to beef, sheep, tillage, and mixed farming. This image just shows one of our National Farm Survey recorders, Kevin McNamara, on the left, and one of our Signpost farmers, dairy farmer David Fenley from County Laois. And the reason I put this image up is because we've worked very closely with the National Farm Survey team in Teagasc to record data from the Signpost farms through 2021. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Signpost farmers in recording that data and of the National Farm Survey data recorders for collecting the data, and also colleagues Brian and Cathal for data analysis and Siobhan and Owen for generation of the graphics and images that are going to follow. Also, each Signpost farmer will receive an individual farm report. About 2/3 of our Signpost farmers have received this report already in draft format, and before the end of the year we'll get out an individual report to each Signpost farmer, and it will contain the types of information which I'm going to present over the next number of minutes. Over the next number of slides, I'm going to look at 4 enterprises, starting initially with dairy, then beef, then sheep, then tillage. And I'm firstly going to look at a summary overview of the key sustainability metrics that we gathered from the farms last year, before looking at in a little bit more depth into 4 key performance indicators. That's total greenhouse gases emissions per kilo of output, nitrogen use efficiency, and the level of protected urea use. Starting with our dairy farms, so we have 45 dairy farmers participating as Signpost farms. On average last year, these farmers generated 988 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per farm, with a carbon footprint of 0.93 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. And the first one is using the IPCC methodology, and the second one is using the LCA methodology. And down towards the bottom of the image here behind me, you can see a number of key performance indicators for the Signpost dairy farms. 28% nitrogen use efficiency, 48% protected urea use, 92% of slurry spread using LESS, and 80% of slurry spread in the springtime. And you also see on the far left, bottom left of this screen, you can see that the profitability figure was just over €2,000 per hectare for these 45 dairy farmers on average last year. Moving on to the second image for our dairy farms, we have 4 charts behind me now. You can see that on I suppose the reason I'm putting up these charts is to show the variation in performance for these key performance indicators amongst our 45 dairy farms. And for example, in terms of total emissions in the top left here, you can see that there's quite a range in total emissions, but that's reflective of the scale of operation, farm size, the number of dairy cows. In the chart here to my left, you can see the carbon footprint figure, or the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. Again, you can see a range here. What is, I suppose, giving me confidence on this chart is that we have a significant number of our dairy signpost farms are below or have a lower carbon footprint per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk than does the typical dairy farmer. The typical dairy farmer is represented by the NFS average. So I guess this suggests that there's opportunities for more farmers to improve their efficiency of milk production and to reduce their greenhouse gas carbon footprint, and in turn then allow that to contribute to reducing their total farm greenhouse gas emissions. On the bottom 2 charts, and looking firstly, I suppose, at the bottom left, you can see nitrogen use efficiency. Again, a range in performance here. A number of our signpost dairy farmers are below the figure typically recorded on our typical dairy farm, but also there are a number of our signpost dairy farmers that are achieving nitrogen use efficiency figures of above 30%. And that's quite an achievement, and I suppose what we have to do is to figure out what's going on those specific farms and then use that knowledge to help other farmers to improve their nitrogen use efficiency performance. And on the bottom right hand, you can see that in terms of the protected urea usage, we have a range of adoption of that technology on our dairy farms. But again, there are farmers that are using significant amounts of protected urea as part of their annual fertilizer program. And again, we have to listen to those farmers and look and see what they're doing to figure out how they're making that happen and what difference it's making on their farm. Moving on then to our beef farms, we have 36 signpost beef farms. On average, they generated 429 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per farm, with a greenhouse gas carbon footprint of 9.2 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo of beef live weight. Down at the bottom of this slide, again along the bottom here, you can see a number of the key performance indicators that we've calculated for these farms last year, with a nitrogen use efficiency figure of 16%, 18% protected urea usage, 42% of slurry spread using LASS, and 71% of slurry spread in the springtime. And over on the far left, you see a profitability figure reported as well. So again, there's a figure there for profitability. Similar to our dairy farms, we look at the same 4 key performance indicators in more detail. And again, similar to our dairy farms, you see the range in performance, okay? And that, I suppose, is reflective of the different scale of operation, the different levels of efficiency, the different levels of practice adoption on our signpost beef farms. But again, similar to our dairy signpost farmers, we already have beef signpost farmers who are achieving high levels of performance in terms of a low carbon footprint per kilo of beef produced, or a high nitrogen use efficiency, or a high level of protected urea usage on their farms. So again, we have to look at those signpost beef farmers that are already achieving the types of performance that we talk about in terms of targets, and we have to use their experience and share it with other beef farmers to try and bring about more change. Moving on then to our sheep farms, we have 8 signpost sheep farms. On average, they generated 245 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per farm, with a carbon footprint of 11 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo of sheep live weight. And the same key performance indicators are showing along the bottom of this chart as were shown previously, including a profitability figure on the far left. And likewise to the beef and the dairy farmers, we have the same charts here, and these charts demonstrate the range in performance. And again, similar to the comments I made for our Signpost beef farmers, the range performance reflects different levels of efficiency, different levels of farm scale, different levels of practice adoption. And we'll be working with our Signpost sheep farmers, as we will with all our Signpost farmers, to improve the performance on average of our Signpost farmers towards the targets that we have set out to achieve under the programme. And the final enterprise I look at is our tillage enterprise. On average here you can see our tillage farms generated the least amount of carbon dioxide per farm at 188 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per farm. And down along the bottom of this chart you can see that on average the nitrogen usage was 138 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, and 35% of tillage ground on these farms for spring crops was sown with a cover crop as well. And on the far left of this chart, similar to the other enterprises, we have a profitability figure. Just on this chart, we just have one additional chart. It's just showing the range in total greenhouse gas emissions per farm for each of the tillage enterprises. And the larger tillage farm has the largest level of overall emissions. We have a bit more work to do with the tillage data, so I'm not able to present any more detail just at this point. So in summary, we have established a robust baseline for our Signpost farmers for 2021. I've presented a selection of results this morning. During 2022, our National Farm Survey data recorders such as Kevin will be revisiting our Signpost farmers such as David and collecting the same data for 2022. So in 2023, I'll be able to present results that will compare the 2022 performance with the 2021 performance, and we'll begin to see if our advisory efforts in supporting the Signpost farmers are beginning to bear dividends in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our Signpost farms. But I guess that's all in the future. Before I finish, I just want to say a word about some results that are beginning to come true from our National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, or NASCO research project. Already last autumn, our soil sampling technicians visited 101 of our Signpost farms and intensively soil sampled the farms. 3,000 soil samples in total were lifted and analysed in the laboratory subsequently. Also, colleagues in Johnstown Castle have erected carbon flux towers on a number of sites across the country, including a number of Signpost farms. And it's also planned that next year that we'll get back out onto Signpost farms and take samples to a deeper depth, up to 1 metre in depth, from a number of sites on each farm. And all the data then that's gathered through that research project will be combined to come up with better estimates for the level of soil carbon sequestration in our soils. But the information that has come through to us already are the results of the soil samples that were lifted last autumn and last winter. As I said, 3,000 soil samples in total lifted and analysed from 101 Signpost farms. And starting on the top left here with soil pH, 56% of our soils have optimum soil pH at above pH 6.2, with 77% of our soils with a lime requirement of less than 2.5 tonnes per hectare. On the phosphorus index, we can see that 63% had phosphorus index of index 3 or 4, and 76% had a phosphorus index of index 3 or 4. When we put all that together, we can see in the chart here in the bottom right that 39% of the soil samples were classed as having optimum soil fertility. That's the correct soil pH and the right levels of phosphorus and potash. That's a good performance, but there is scope for improvement. So there's some work to be done in terms of increasing the percentage of soils that have optimum fertility for agronomic production. And finally then, in the middle chart on the bottom of this slide, we just see a representation of the soil samples, soil organic carbon results. And 2/3 of our soil samples had a soil organic carbon levels to 10 centimetres of between 2 and 6%. So that's just an initial sample of results from the NASCO research project. And with that, I'll conclude and hand it back to Pat.
Thank you, Tom. A lot of work has gone into getting this far, and there's a lot to take in, and I think we're only at the start of a journey in relation to the data. Again, could I remind you to put your questions for both Tom and Cathal into the Q&A. Tom, a question from the audience. How important are these results to the Signpost programme, including both the aggregate and the individual farm reports?
Yeah, I think as we heard our director Frank O'Mara saying in the earlier clip, Pat, very important that farmers have measures to know where they're starting from and what progress they're making on their journey. So again, as the director said, this is the first time that individual farmers will receive individualised or farm-specific reports from the National Farm Survey with their own farm sustainability metrics. And our advisors then can work with the farmers to interpret the results and also then to make plans on how they can improve performance over the coming years. That methodology has worked for us in Teagasc in the past in terms of setting the baseline, sitting down with the farmer to agree an action plan and then tracking progress over time.
Okay, we're now joined by Dr. Cara Gustenberg of UCD. Cara is a member of the Climate Change Council and is also a member of the Signpost Programme Steering Committee. Cara, I believe you were coming to us from Galway this morning.
Yeah, I'm at the National Association of Principals and Deputies annual conference where they're working on the new Leaving Cert module in climate action and sustainable development. So, good to be here.
Okay, Cara, as a member of the Climate Change Advisory Council, you have a particular interest in how Ireland can transition to a low carbon economy. What do these results suggest to you about the ability of farmers to take on board the changes that are needed to reach that goal?
Thanks, Pat. I think Cathal said it really well, and Tom followed with the similar sentiment that it's year 2 when we really start the journey. That's when we'll really start to be able to see changes. But already, I would guess that the audience felt the same way as I did, which is that there's a ton of data already available now from year 1 that we can be exploring in terms of looking at bringing some of those farmers who were at the below average end in some of the KPIs to the above average end to join some of the other farmers who were exceeding maybe expectations. So there's a lot of learning already in that data and linking those practices over to the soil fertility data that Tom presented there at the end. And I think it's really exciting that it shows that we can already start to learn lessons from the maybe better performing farms and bring them into the less performing farms. So it's a great opportunity. My only frustration is that this project wasn't in place when I was doing my PhD in Teagasc 15 years ago, because I think the issue was as important then as it is now, and what a great opportunity to really learn and start to bend that emissions curve in agriculture.
And how important is it, in your opinion, that we can extend beyond the signpost farms and have this kind of data available to all farmers?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the number one questions I get asked when I'm speaking to the public is, what can I do at home to do something about climate change? And I always say, well, you have to start by knowing your individual carbon footprint, and you can't actually improve or get better until you have that baseline data. And the same thing applies to farms as it does to our households. We have to have the baseline data on every farm to be able to tell farmers or to help farmers in actually getting that down and addressing the climate issues. So it's absolutely essential that we have this information.
And I suppose the agriculture has a sectoral emissions target of 25% by 2030. What are your thoughts of how we translate these sectoral targets into what they mean for individual farmers?
Yeah, I think we'll see the kind of ability of the Signpost programme to feed into achieving that national target in year 2 when we start to see what the signpost farms are actually doing in terms of emissions reductions. But already we can see that there might be some opportunity there, that we might start to see some emissions reductions in terms of nitrogen use efficiency and use of protected urea, and that there's a lot of potential there. But there's huge urgency. I mean, we really need to implement on a wide scale as soon as possible. I don't think we can wait until we have 5 years of data from Signposts before we can start implementing on a larger scale if we're really going to achieve this 25% emissions reduction target in the agricultural sector.
Okay, some questions coming in from the audience for all of our speakers. A quick one, Tom, that might be related or best answered by you. Are there organic farms in the Signpost programme?
Yes, indeed, Pat, there are. We have 119 farmers signed up as Signpost farmers currently, and we're working with those farmers. And included in that number are 5 organic farmers. There's 2 dairy, 2 beef and 1 tillage. Amongst the organic farmers, there's also a poultry farmer. We have 2 pig farmers, and we have a number of our own Teagasc research demonstration farms, and all our agricultural colleges are signed up as Signpost farms. And the exact same measurements which I presented earlier are being taken on those farms. I just didn't have time to present them all today.
Okay. Another question, very interesting to see the quantitative approach being taken. Great to put numbers on this. What weight are put on each of the dimensions or the legs of the stool that you talked about, Cathal?
Well, as I kind of say in the launch last Monday, no one leg of the stool is more important than the other. So, we don't weight them. We just say they're equal importance. So if a farm's not economically viable, they mightn't be sustainable in the long term. We know about the issues about environmental sustainability, how we to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there is no one number, Pat, we can say, this person is X amount sustainable. It's really, in those 3 dimensions, you have to think about sustainability.
Okay. I suppose a technical question, is the CO2 calculation done by using GWP 100 or GWP star? And if not, will GWP star start to come into the calculations that you're doing?
Yeah, we're using the GWP 100, so we're basically replicating what's happening at the national inventories level. We could potentially transition to GWP star, but we'll wait for we'll go in the same direction as the inventories, because that's how our emissions are going to be measured. So we'll kind of follow the science path on that one.
Okay. One for you, Tom. Can you see a consistent picture of higher profitability per hectare with lower emissions?
We haven't actually looked at that comparison yet, Pat, but it's a very good question, and it's one of the objectives of the Signpost programme, that we can show a way to agriculture that's both more profitable and also produces less greenhouse gas emissions while looking after the environment. So we have to do that analysis. I think from the figures I presented, what I can say is that the Signpost farmers appear to be at least as profitable, if not more profitable on average, than the National Farm Survey, the typical dairy farmer or beef farmer or sheep farmer or tillage farmer. But we will look at that to see if there is a relationship between levels of profitability and levels of greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Carl, addressing to you, you showed reducing greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product, but increasing overall farm emissions per farm and per hectare level. How consistent is that with moving towards our greenhouse gas targets?
Okay. As I kind of went into more detail last Monday in terms of there's a dairy and non-dairy story. I guess the non-dairy systems, their emissions are relatively stable through time, the last 6-8 years. But the dairy side, the emissions have been increasing post milk quota abolition. And the 3 components, on the dairy side, we looked at carbon footprint, which has been declining, which is efficiency gain. The output per cow has actually been increasing, which is efficiency gain. but those efficiency gains have been overridden by increasing herd size. I think their average herd size has gone from 70 to 90 cows. So, we have to, the footprint is obviously good, it's declining, but we also have to look at absolute emissions. So, we have to, if we're to meet this 25% target, we have to get the absolute emissions down. So like all the measures that are in the MAC curve and stuff that's in development will have to be brought to bear on our farms, particularly on the methane side, to get us anywhere close to the 35, to get us to at 25%. So we really have to, all technologies in development and existing technologies have to be adopted for us to get where we need to go.
Yeah, you mentioned the recent sustainability report, and there's a number of trends in it. What trends are there coming from that sustainability report that I suppose give you optimism that we're moving in the right direction, and maybe what trends are concerning?
Well, I guess on the dairy side, it's the economic powerhouse, highly profitable, a lot more so than the other systems. But also, and I raised it last Monday of concern about the number of hours the dairy farmers are working. It's a question mark whether the amount of hours they're working are sustainable in the long run, because it's trending upwards towards 3,000 hours a year, which is a crazy amount of hours. On the emission side, there's positive stories when it comes to ammonia. The adoption of things like low emission slurry spreading and protected urea are seeing our ammonia emissions declining. Our GHG emissions is a tricky one because it's again it's dairy versus non-dairy side. The non-dairy side are relatively stable. The dairy side emissions are trending upwards on the back of increased herd sizes, and it would actually be larger. The emissions would be larger if we hadn't achieved efficiency gains in terms of the footprint and the output per cow. So we really kind of need to, I suppose, get everything we can adopted on dairy farms to get that curve trending downwards in the future.
I suppose on that one, Pat, if you look at the Signpost farmers, dairy farmers as a group, they've adopted the mitigation actions such as the usage of protected urea, increased usage of low emission slurry spreading, and the application of slurry in the springtime were the three mitigation actions I presented. And I suppose I just ask Cathal to comment, if the typical dairy farmer as represented in your sample were to be achieving the same level of adoption of those mitigation actions, would it make a big difference, do you think, to the national picture? Or how big a difference would it make to the national picture?
Oh, it'd certainly make a difference, and it's really, but at the same time, if we had a stable herd, and we adopt these practices, it would definitely shift the curve downwards. But I suppose it is, what we're seeing in the data is that the herd sizes are tend to override the efficiency gains. So, it's just a case of trying to get to a point where farmers are happy with their herd size, but also in terms of their work-life balance. I keep going back to the hours worked. If they're adding more animals, but they're actually working a lot more hours as well. So that question mark is in my mind is whether the system is sustainable from a work-life balance perspective, if not from an environmental perspective. So look, I think that there are definitely opportunities on the average farm compared to Signpost. They're not at the frontier in terms significant room to improve in terms of, okay, they move towards less, but protected urea is the levels are improving, but from a very low base, like 7%. So if we could add up, would be a big difference in the emissions profile.
Okay, and I suppose just moving, you mentioned a couple of issues around soil fertility and the use of protected urea, and we have a good few questions coming in the area of soil fertility. And it's emphasised. But how does soil fertility have a significant bearing in terms of our objectives to reach our greenhouse gas emissions targets?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Pat. And I suppose sometimes we perhaps we fail to make the connection between that improving soil fertility message and the reducing emissions message. So it's a very relevant question. I suppose how it helps is that as farmers improve soil fertility, so they correct soil pH deficiencies, improve soil P and K levels to optimum index 3, those activities then will allow the soil to release more nitrogen, which is in the soil naturally, and the farmer then can consequently dial back the fertilizer spreader, can reduce the amount of chemical fertilizer added to the crop. Also, through the use of low emission slurry spreading and the application of slurry in the springtime, you get better value from your slurry, more of the nitrogen is returned to the crop, and the consequence of that should be for the farmer, should be that you're able to reduce your fertiliser input. Now, I think there's evidence from across the Signpost farms this year in particular, with both with the emphasis on improving soil fertility, but also with the high price of fertiliser as an input, farmers are taking more notice of better soil fertility and of the usage of animal slurries, and they're tailoring their fertiliser programs accordingly.
Okay, thanks for that. And I suppose what's more a comment than a question from one of our colleagues who talks about the indication that index 4 is particularly for P is part of our optimal from a soil fertility and a growth perspective, but just making the point that we need to make sure to balance our applications to try and keep it down at index 3. So I think
absolutely there's an opportunity for savings, and again it goes back to that earlier question about the linkage between looking after the environment and improving the profitability or reducing the costs of food production. So that's a clear example of a situation where the farmer has an opportunity to reduce their fertiliser inputs, in that case phosphorus, and save costs and look after the environment.
Okay, a question as to how does the overall programme and the information that we're providing link with the work that's been done by Board BIA in terms of their sustainability report?
Yeah, another good question. We're both trying to achieve the same thing, and Board BIA are partners in the Signpost programme. So we work very closely with Board BIA is the first point. The second point, the big linkage I would see currently is that I have presented results earlier for the sustainability metrics for the Signpost farms. Cathal has presented results earlier this week for a typical farm across the country. And for any farmer then, and I believe there's between 55 and 56,000 farmers are members of the Board BIA quality assurance schemes. All 18,000 dairy farmers are members, and there's a sizable number of beef farmers are members as well. And those farmers then, as a result of completing the sustainability audit, that's part of that every 18 months audit, they receive a farmer feedback report. And on that farmer feedback report, there are a number of key performance indicators provided, and they are very similar to the ones that I presented earlier. So if you're a farmer listening, I guess you can have a look at your farmer feedback report from Board BIA, and you can see what your carbon footprint is, you can see what your nitrogen use efficiency figure is, and you should be able to compare that with the performance of your local Signpost farmer, and you can then start to see whether you're ahead of or the same as or behind the performance of a Signpost farmer, and use that as a guide or a benchmark.
Okay. Cara, I suppose one that you might begin with, why are we talking about reducing the beef herd and reducing emissions from the beef sector if greenhouse gases are stable in this sector versus the dairy farms where greenhouse gases are rising?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has come right out and said it's necessarily beef over dairy. I think it's total emissions that we have to reduce, and we have a 25% target across the agricultural sector, and we still don't yet have a plan on how that 25% will be allocated. But we were talking about, essentially an average. It may be 25% in some farms, maybe more in others, and maybe less in others. But that plan has not been presented, and what we need very badly is leadership from the sector, within government and within stakeholder groups, to put forward a plan that does work, that actually makes sense for all the different types of agriculture we have, and also keeps in mind that we have biodiversity issues. And one of the advantages of some of our beef farming is that it's low intensity, and it is actually maybe more advantageous for biodiversity. And we are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis in addition to a climate crisis, so we have to keep that at the front of our mind, in addition to the water quality issues that we're facing too. So I definitely don't think it's necessarily beef versus dairy because of all the environmental issues that we're facing.
Okay, and I think to follow on from that, there has been a lot of focus on dairy herd size, and I suppose you're looking at the ability of farms through looking at the MAC to try and reduce our emissions. How confident are you that we can reach the 25% without necessarily cutting the national herd?
Yeah, I think Cathal really explained it well when he said we have to implement essentially everything on that MAC curve in a majority of Irish farms to get even close to achieving that 25% target, which means we still have some shortfall there that we're not going to meet just by implementing everything in the MAC curve. And I think we know enough about behavioral change to know that even having the expectation that we're going to do everything on that MAC curve across most farms in Ireland is probably unrealistic. So we are going to have to step back and look at our food production system more generally and figure out where we're going to get that extra 5% or whatever it is to achieve the targets. And we need to have a conversation with everybody on how we approach that. So I don't think anyone is all that confident of meeting the 25% target based on business as usual. I think the MAC analysis is showing that that's probably not a realistic assessment.
And Pat, can I come in there? I think the important thing for listeners is to be very clear that we need to take action now. We need to all work together to support farmers take on the mitigation actions that are clearly identified, so that an increasing number of farmers are reporting that they're using protected urea, that they've reduced fertiliser nitrogen usage, that they're using more clover, that they're using low emission slurry spreading. All these technologies are there to be used by farmers, and once they're used by farmers, we will see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we, in the future, more technologies will come forward, and we can talk then in the future about what those technologies are and what the potential of those technologies are. But for now, we urgently need to make a start. So I'd absolutely support Cara in that.
Okay. There was a question there as to the availability of the draft report, and it's available on the signpost page if you check the Teagasc Signpost page. Cathal, a question for you. Are there plans to collect more data on the NFS in relation to the signpost farms and I suppose in general terms and in the near future?
Yeah, I suppose, Pat, we're constantly looking to see where we can collect more activity data to answer questions. Like, for example, soil fertility is a bit of a gap we have in the National Farm Survey in terms of our general farms. So we've been looking at maybe trying to link in with things like NMP Online and pasture-based to leverage data that's in those databases. So it's kind of a work in progress. On the biodiversity one, again, like we've been working with John Finn and other ecologists in Teagasc to come up with a kind of a way of estimating, or kind of a matrix or an index of estimating biodiversity. So we think we have a working framework. What we're waiting for is kind of a national habitats map to be published. So, as I said, when we started in 2013, we probably had half the amount of indicators we have now. So we're constantly trying to add to that suite of measures based on activity data we can get through the National Farm Survey.
Tom, in relation to, I suppose, spreading the message from signpost farms right out to the whole farming community, advisors are going to be a key part of it, both Teagasc and private advisors. I suppose, what would you like to see them take on board in terms of working with their clients to try and get the messages out there and to try and get farmers to take on board the actions that we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I suppose firstly, each of the signpost farmers, and there's 120 of them across the country, spread right across the country, will get an individual report. So, and the person who knows that farmer best is their local advisor. So in the first instance, I'd hope that local advisors would engage deeply with their signpost farmers in their locality, perhaps organise for groups of advisors to go out onto that farm and to see what's going on and explore the data. So that's one. Number two then, I suppose, to engage with any training that's offered, and we will be offering training. The reports that Cathal presented earlier this week and that I present this morning contain new performance indicators and new metrics. And it takes time to become familiar with those measures and to understand maybe why a measure is high or low on a farm. What's driving that change in that performance figure. So I suppose that the second thing then is that there's a responsibility in all advisors to familiarise yourself with these new performance indicators and new metrics. Our dairy advisors are very familiar with EBI and milk solids per cow or per hectare and tons of grass dry matter grown. But there was a time when dairy advisors, we're not familiar with those metrics, but by engaging with the figures, by talking with colleagues about them, by engaging with farmers, by using the figures then at farm walks and events, the familiarity and grew with the figures. And I wouldn't see it any different in terms of coming to grips with total greenhouse gas emissions, total ammonia emissions, greenhouse gas per hectare, or so on.
And finally, how are farmers reacting to the reports that they're getting?
I think similar to advisors, there's a number of new metrics being presented to farmers for the first time. So they're asking questions, and I have heard some reports that some farmers, when they've looked at the reports, they've questioned some of the figures, and they've queried as to why a figure is as it is. So that's good. That's good. We can expect a lot of questions in this initial phase. And then as people become familiar with how the figures are calculated and the relevance of the figures to their farm, they'll become more comfortable, and they'll be able to start making decisions and start making future plans based on the information that's available to them.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And I'd like to thank our contributors, Cara, Cathal. I would also like to thank our production team of Declan McCardle and Rachel Grehan, and to the series producers Andy Boland and Yvonne Marr. Next week we'll be joined by Dr. Mary Ryan, who will be telling us about the Watermark project, which aims to mitigate the impacts of agriculture on water through research and knowledge transfer. With that, I'll leave you and wish you well till next week. Thanks and goodbye.